The chalk snapped in half, and the entire classroom went silent. A beautiful young professor smiled, thinking she had just made a harmless joke. "Solve this equation," she said, laughing, "and I'll marry you." The students laughed louder. Phones came out. Because the joke wasn't meant for them. It was meant for the black janitor standing quietly by the door, holding a mop. No one knew his name. No one knew his past. And no one was ready for what happened next. Because when he stepped forward, the laughter died. And in that moment, everything they believed about power, intelligence, and worth was about to shatter. The chalk snapped in half so loud it felt like a gunshot, and the sound cracked straight through the bright classroom, slicing laughter into silence. Every head lifted. Every breath paused. For a moment, no one moved, because moments like that don't happen in rooms where futures are supposed to be clean, planned, and safe. Sunlight flooded through tall windows, pouring over polished desks and glossy notebooks, lighting up faces that had never learned how to look down. These students wore confidence like perfume. Their clothes were pressed. Their lives felt promised. They believed the world was already arranged in their favor, and this room was proof of it. At the front stood Professor Eleanor Whitmore, young and beautiful in a quiet, powerful way, the kind of beauty that didn't need to try. Her posture was perfect, her voice always calm. Her reputation followed her into every room before she even spoke. She was the kind of professor students bragged about knowing, the kind whose approval felt like a stamp on their future. She held the broken chalk between her fingers, glanced at it, then smiled. It wasn't a sharp smile, not yet. It was light, almost playful, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you are untouchable. She turned back to the board and began writing again, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The chalk scraped across the green surface, leaving behind a long, ugly equation that stretched wider and wider as she added more symbols. Numbers tangled with letters. Fractions stacked on fractions. It didn't look like math anymore, it looked like a wall. She stepped back and tilted her head, admiring it like a painting. Then she laughed. "Solve this equation," she said, her voice floating easily through the room, "and I'll marry you." For half a second, the words didn't land. Then the room exploded. Laughter burst from every corner. Chairs creaked as students leaned back. Phones came up fast, screens glowing as clips began recording. Someone whistled, someone clapped, someone repeated the line louder, already turning it into a joke that would live online forever. Professor Whitmore raised her hands slightly, pretending to calm the room, but she was smiling too. She enjoyed this part. The attention. The control. "I'm kidding, of course," she added, still smiling, still amused. "Some problems are meant for minds trained for them." Her eyes didn't move toward the students. They shifted to the side of the room, toward him. The janitor stood near the door, frozen in place, one hand wrapped around the handle of a mop, the other resting on a yellow bucket that had seen better days. His clothes were faded, stretched thin from too many washes. His shoes were clean but worn, the kind that told a long story without saying a word. His skin was dark, his face quiet, his presence so familiar it had become invisible. He had been cleaning these classrooms for months, maybe years. He came in before dawn and left after dark. He erased boards, swept floors, picked up trash left behind by people who never wondered who cleaned it. No one had ever asked his name. Now every eye in the room was on him. The laughter grew sharper. Someone nudged another student and nodded toward the janitor. Someone whispered something cruel. Someone else laughed too loud, like they wanted to be heard. Professor Whitmore's smile softened into something thinner. She shrugged lightly, as if the moment meant nothing. As if he meant nothing. The janitor lowered his eyes. Not fast, not dramatically, just enough. It looked like shame to anyone who didn't know better, but it wasn't. It was restraint. It was the practiced motion of a man who had learned when to look down so he wouldn't be forced to look away forever. No one noticed the way his fingers tightened around the mop handle. No one noticed the slight shift in his shoulders, like something old had stirred inside him. No one noticed the way his eyes lifted again, slow and steady, landing not on the professor, not on the students, but on the equation itself. He didn't look confused. He looked curious. The chalk dust floated in the air, catching the sunlight, hanging there like tiny ghosts. The equation loomed large, messy, arrogant in its complexity. To the students, it was a spectacle. To Professor Whitmore, it was a weapon disguised as wit. To the janitor, it was something else entirely. The bell rang. The sharp sound snapped the moment in half, releasing the room from its tension. Chairs scraped back, bags zipped, laughter returned, louder now, freer. Students poured out in clusters, replaying the joke, editing it, already planning captions. Some glanced back at the board, shook their heads, and laughed again. Others didn't even look. They had already moved on. Professor Whitmore gathered her papers, her movement smooth, practiced. She didn't look at the janitor as she passed him. She didn't need to. The power imbalance had already spoken for her. Soon the room was empty, except for the equation, and the janitor. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the echo of footsteps fading down the hall, the laughter dissolving into distant noise. The sunlight still poured in, but now it felt colder, harsher, like it was exposing something instead of warming it. The room smelled faintly of chalk and cleaning solution, a mix of intellect and labor that never quite touched. He set the mop against the wall. Slowly, he walked toward the board. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of memory. Memories pressed in quietly, the way they always did when the world tried to remind him who it thought he was. He remembered other rooms, other boards, other equations. He remembered standing on the other side of the desk once, his hands clean, his mind sharp, his future wide open. He remembered when people listened. He stopped a few feet from the board and looked up. Really looked. The equation stared back at him, bold and unafraid. It was complicated, yes, but not impossible. It wasn't mocking him. It wasn't laughing. It was just there, waiting, like it always had. He smiled faintly, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Behind him the door creaked open. A student had forgotten something. He paused when he saw the janitor standing there so close to the board. The student hesitated, then smirked. "You good, man?" he asked, trying not to laugh. The janitor didn't turn around. "I'm fine," he said quietly. The student shrugged and left, shaking his head, already sending a message to someone, already turning the moment into another joke. The door closed again. Silence returned. The janitor raised his hand just a little, as if testing the air. His fingers twitched, remembering the weight of chalk, the feel of solving something hard and true. He didn't touch the board, not yet. He just stood there, breathing, letting the noise of the world fade out. For the first time that day, the classroom felt honest. The equation remained untouched, stretched across the board like a challenge thrown without care. It had been meant to embarrass, meant to remind, meant to put someone back in their place. But places change. And sometimes, so do people. He stepped back, picked up his mop again, and finished his work. He cleaned the desks. He emptied the trash. He erased nothing on the board. When he was done, he paused at the door and looked back one last time at the equation glowing softly in the afternoon light. He nodded to himself. Then he turned off the lights and walked out, leaving the room quiet, the challenge still hanging there, waiting for the next move, waiting for a truth no one in that room was ready for yet. By the next morning, the laughter had already grown teeth. It spread through the campus like smoke slipping under doors, crawling across screens, settling into minds before breakfast. A short clip, a frozen smile, a cruel joke wrapped in humor, the janitor standing near the door, the professor laughing, the equation on the board. It didn't need context. It didn't need truth. It only needed an audience, and it found one. Phones buzzed nonstop. Group chats lit up. Social feeds refreshed again and again. Millions of views stacked fast, faster than anyone expected. Comments poured in like rain, careless and cold. "Did you see his face? Janitor thought he was Einstein. Know your place." People who had never stepped foot on that campus felt bold enough to judge a man they had never met. They laughed from couches and buses and bedrooms, tapping screens without ever seeing his eyes. To them, he wasn't a person. He was a moment. A joke. Something to scroll past. By the time the sun rose fully, the classroom was already full. Students came early, not with notebooks open, not with minds ready, but with excitement buzzing under their skin. They whispered and laughed and pointed at the board like it was a stage. Some pretended they were there to learn, but their eyes kept drifting to the door. They were waiting, waiting for him, waiting for the professor, waiting for something else to laugh at. Professor Eleanor Whitmore arrived right on time. Her steps were steady, her face calm, her hair perfectly in place. She looked like she always did, composed, confident, untouched. But inside, something stirred. She had seen the video. Of course she had. Everyone had tagged her, praised her wit, called her brilliant, called her savage, called her iconic. She told herself she didn't care. But she did. She thrived on admiration, on being the sharpest mind in the room, on knowing people watched her, listened to her, respected her. The laughter fed something deep inside her, something she didn't like to name. It felt good to be untouchable. It felt good to be above it all. When she pushed the classroom door open, the noise softened instantly. And then she saw him. The janitor was already there. He stood at the front of the room, close to the board, a rag in his hand. He wasn't erasing the equation. He wasn't changing it. He was simply wiping away chalk dust, careful not to disturb the symbols, as if they mattered, as if they deserved respect. For a moment, Eleanor froze. She hadn't expected him so early. She hadn't expected him at all. The room watched closely. Phones lowered, but not all the way. Smiles stretched, waiting for something to happen. Eleanor sighed. Not loud, not angry, just enough to be heard. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "This is an academic environment. It wasn't meant to be cruel." That's what she told herself. It was practical, proper. Boundaries mattered. The janitor turned slowly to face her. His expression was calm, neutral, not defensive. "I know," he said. 2 words, soft, respectful. But something about the way he said them unsettled her. There was no apology in his voice, no embarrassment, just certainty. Students whispered. Some laughed openly now, feeling braver with an audience. Someone in the back nudged another student and nodded toward the janitor like he was part of the show. Eleanor walked to her desk, set her bag down, and faced the room. She straightened her posture, slipping back into the role that always protected her. A hand shot up. "Professor," a student asked, trying to hide a grin, "is the equation still unsolved?" A ripple of laughter followed. Eleanor smiled. A practiced smile, controlled. "Of course it is," she said. She glanced briefly at the board, then back at the class. To her, the moment felt contained. Handled. The joke had run its course, the power balance restored. Then a voice rose from the back of the room. Quiet, steady. "May I try?" The room froze. Not slowly. Instantly, it was as if the air had been sucked out, leaving everyone suspended in the same breath. Heads turned, eyes widened, someone gasped. Someone laughed too early, then stopped. The janitor stood near the door, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't shaking, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just asking. Chaos followed. Laughter crashed back in, louder and sharper than before. It wasn't playful now, it was defensive, nervous, mean. Someone clapped slowly, mocking. Someone else shook their head, whispering something ugly. A student near the front laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. This wasn't part of the plan. She looked at the janitor, really looked at him this time. His face was unreadable. His eyes were focused, not on her, but on the board. The equation waited behind her like a loaded question. For a split second, she considered shutting it down, telling him no, ending the moment before it spiraled. But the room was watching. The cameras were ready. And something else tugged at her too. Curiosity, pride, a quiet desire to prove once and for all that she belonged exactly where she stood. She nodded. "Go ahead," she said. "Let's all learn something." The words landed heavier than she intended. The janitor didn't hesitate. He walked forward. Each step echoed louder than it should have, his shoes tapping against the floor in a rhythm that cut through. The noise. The laughter softened, then thinned, as people leaned forward in their seats. Phones rose again, capturing every move. He reached the board. He picked up the chalk. The white stick looked small in his fingers, fragile. Dust clung to his skin. For a moment he held it there, suspended, as if feeling its weight, its memory. Someone laughed nervously. Then he wrote. The chalk moved, not fast, not slow. Certain, a line here, a symbol there. His hand didn't shake, his eyes didn't dart around for approval. He didn't explain himself, he didn't perform. He worked. The room shifted. Whispers died mid-sentence. Laughter fell away, replaced by confusion. A student near the front frowned, leaning closer. Another tilted her head, squinting at the board. Professor Whitmore stepped forward without realizing she had moved. Her heels stopped inches from the chalk tray. Her breath caught. What he was doing looked familiar, too familiar. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't copying something he half remembered. He was choosing steps with care, like someone who knew where the path led. The equation began to change. What had once looked messy started to breathe. Terms canceled out. Shapes emerged. The chaos thinned into structure. A murmur rippled through the room. "That's not wrong," someone whispered. Eleanor's heart beat faster. She scanned the board, her mind racing ahead, checking his work before he finished it. Her confidence wavered just a little. She told herself, it was impossible. Told herself she was overthinking. The janitor paused. The chalk hovered. The room leaned in. He added one more line, then another, and then he stepped back. Silence fell so heavy it pressed against every chest. Eleanor stared at the board. Once, twice, her hands trembled, because the solution was right, not partially, not accidentally, completely. A student gasped. Another swore under their breath. Phones dipped, forgotten for the first time that morning. Eleanor swallowed. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. The janitor turned to face her. "I used to teach it," he said quietly. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. He looked around the room, at the students who had laughed, at the faces now pale with shock. Before life decided I was worth less than my mind. No one laughed. No one moved. The chalk rested on the tray, untouched, like it was waiting too. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like something fragile had cracked open, and everyone could feel the cold air rushing in. The janitor met Eleanor's eyes. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he said. "I came here to work, to survive." He glanced at the board one last time. "And sometimes," he added, "that's the hardest equation of all." He set the chalk down. The sound was soft, but it echoed louder than laughter ever had. And in that moment, nothing felt finished. It felt like something had only just begun. The chalk moved with confidence, and that alone was enough to change the air in the room. Not rushed, not shaky, not unsure, just steady, certain, like a hand that had done this before many times in rooms where people listened instead of laughed. The janitor's fingers guided the chalk across the board as if the equation were speaking back to him, as if they were having a private conversation no one else could hear. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't ask for silence. He didn't explain what he was doing because he wasn't there to perform. He was there to finish something that had been left hanging in the air like a dare. He didn't look at the students. He didn't look at Professor Whitmore. He looked only at the equation, his eyes calm, almost warm, like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years but never forgot. There was no anger in his face, no need to prove anyone wrong, just focus. The chalk scratched softly, a quiet sound that somehow cut deeper than laughter ever had. Lines formed, symbols shifted. What once looked messy began to make sense. Terms canceled each other out like they were meant to, fractions simplified. The chaos started folding in on itself, becoming something clean, something honest. The whispers died first. One by one, voices fell silent. A student in the front row stopped smiling. Another leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to follow along. Someone in the back lowered their phone, their thumb frozen mid-scroll. The room, once buzzing with jokes and judgment, grew still. Phones lowered, not because anyone was told to, because something felt different now. Professor Whitmore felt it too. Her smile faded, slowly, like a light dimming. She stepped closer to the board without thinking, her heels tapping softly against the floor. Her heart began to beat faster, not with excitement, but with recognition. The method, the steps, the structure of the work unfolding in front of her eyes. It wasn't guesswork, it wasn't luck. It was advanced, obscure, elegant. It was the kind of math you didn't stumble into, the kind you only learned after years of study, after long nights, after standing in front of boards, like this one. Teaching others how to see what most people missed. Her breath caught in her throat. Because she knew this method. She had read about it in journals, studied it briefly in graduate school. She had never taught it here, never expected to see it written in this classroom. And yet there it was, appearing line by line in the careful handwriting of a man she had dismissed without a second thought. The chalk paused. The janitor tilted his head, checking his work. He added one final line, smaller than the rest, then stepped back. He placed the chalk down gently, as if it deserved respect too. The final answer sat there quietly on the board. No flourish, no underline, no announcement, just truth. Silence crashed over the room. Not the awkward silence of embarrassment, the heavy silence of realization. A student gasped. The sound was small but loud enough to break something open. That's correct, the student whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud. Professor Whitmore didn't answer right away. She stared at the board. Once. Her eyes traced the steps, her mind racing ahead, checking each line. Twice. She stepped closer, lifting her hand as if to point, then stopping herself. 3 times. She followed it all the way through, from start to finish, and each time the answer held firm. Her hands began to tremble. She felt it then, the ground shifting beneath her feet, the invisible ladder she had been standing on suddenly wobbling. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the smartest voice in the room. She turned to face him. "Where did you learn this?" she asked. Her voice sounded different now, quieter, stripped of its edge, barely steady. The janitor met her gaze, really met it. There was no pride in his eyes, no satisfaction, just a tired kind of honesty. "I used to teach it," he said quietly. The words landed like a weight. Before anyone could react, before laughter could return, he spoke again. "Before life decided I was worth less than my mind." The room seemed to shrink around them. The sunlight still poured through the windows, but it felt harsher now, like it was exposing something no one wanted to see. The janitor looked around slowly, his eyes moving from face to face. Students who had laughed. Students who had filmed. Students who had judged him without ever knowing his name. Br. Then he looked at Professor Whitmore. Br. At the woman who had joked. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he said. His voice didn't rise, it didn't crack. "I came here to work. To survive." He paused, letting the words settle, letting the truth sink into the cracks that laughter had left behind. "And sometimes," he added, "that's the hardest equation of all." Bree reached down and placed the chalk back on the tray. The sound was soft, almost nothing. Br. But it echoed. Br. It echoed in the quiet room. It echoed in Professor Whitmore's chest. It echoed in the minds of students who suddenly felt smaller, not because he had humiliated them, but because they had humiliated him first. No one spoke, but no one moved. The janitor turned away from the board, picked up his mop and walked back toward the door. His steps were unhurried, calm, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everything had changed. A student near the back, swallowed hard. Another wiped their palms on their jeans. Someone whispered his name, realizing too late they had never bothered to learn it. Professor Whitmore stood frozen, her thoughts colliding. Her confidence, once unshakable, now felt fragile. She replayed the joke in her mind, the laughter, the way she had looked at him without really seeing him. For the first time, she wondered how many other minds had walked past her unseen, how many voices she had never heard because they didn't come wrapped in the right clothes, the right titles, the right tone. The janitor paused at the door. Br. For a moment, it felt like he might say something else, like he might turn around and finish the lesson. He didn't. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving the room suspended in the aftermath of truth. The students sat there, staring at the board, at the answer that made sense of everything and nothing at the same time. The equation that had started as a joke now felt like a mirror. It reflected their assumptions, their comfort, their cruelty. Professor Whitmore finally moved. She walked back to the board and erased nothing. She couldn't bring herself to wipe it away. Not yet. Her hand hovered over the chalk tray, trembling, before she let it fall to her side. But class ended without another word. Students filed out slowly, quietly, their laughter gone, their eyes down. Phones stayed in pockets. No one wanted to be the first to speak. The hallway felt different now, like the walls had heard something they couldn't forget. Professor Whitmore remained alone in the classroom. She stared at the equation one last time, at the elegant solution written by a man she had Ted like he didn't belong. She felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not anger, not fear, shame, and beneath it, something else. A question. What did it mean to be educated, if you couldn't recognize intelligence standing right in front of you? She turned off the lights and left the room, the board still glowing faintly in the fading sunlight. The equation remained, the answer remained. And somewhere down the hall, a janitor pushed his cart forward, carrying a lifetime of knowledge the world had almost thrown away. Nothing felt resolved, not yet. Because when the truth finally shows itself, the hardest part isn't seeing it. It's deciding what to do next. Professor Whitmore stood frozen long after the last student left the room. The door had closed. The hallway noise had faded. The laughter that once filled the space was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Sunlight still streamed through the tall windows, painting soft rectangles on the floor, but it no longer felt warm. It felt exposing, like the room was watching her. The equation was still on the board. She hadn't erased it. She couldn't. It stared back at her now. Not as a challenge, not as a joke, but as a mirror. Every line reflected something she hadn't wanted to see. Her confidence, her carelessness, her quiet cruelty dressed up as humor. She saw herself standing there the day before, smiling, powerful, certain of her place in the world, and she saw him, standing near the door, holding a mop, carrying more knowledge than anyone in that room had bothered to imagine. Her chest tightened. For the first time in her career, she questioned the version of herself she had been so proud of. She turned off the lights and walked out slowly, the echo of her steps following her down the hallway. Students passed her without speaking, their eyes down, their energy changed. The campus felt different now, like something unseen had shifted beneath its polished surface. That night, Professor Whitmore didn't sleep. She lay awake replaying the moment over and over. The laugh, the silence, the chalk moving with confidence. The words he had spoken so calmly, so honestly. Before life decided I was worth less than my mind, the sentence wrapped itself around her thoughts and refused to let go. She thought about power, about how easily it settles into our hands, about how rarely we question it once it does. By morning, she had made a decision. The next day, the classroom was full again, but the energy was different. Students arrived quietly this time. No jokes, no phones raised in secret. The equation was still on the board, untouched, like a sacred thing no one dared to disturb. Whispers floated through the air, but they weren't cruel anymore. They were uncertain, curious, nervous. Professor Whitmore entered the room with a folder in her hands. Her face was calm, but something in her posture had changed. She stood straighter, but not from pride, from resolve. She didn't begin the lecture. Instead, she looked toward the door. A murmur rippled through the room when the janitor stepped inside. He wore the same clothes, the same worn shoes. He pushed the same cart, but the way students looked at him had shifted. Some stared openly now, not with mockery, but with confusion. Others avoided his eyes, shame burning behind their silence. Professor Whitmore cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady but serious, "there's something I need to do." She turned fully toward him. "This is Dr. Samuel Carter," she said. The name landed hard. A ripple of shock moved through the room. She continued, each word measured. "He holds a doctorate in applied mathematics. He taught at universities many of you would dream of attending. He has published work most of us will never fully understand." Dr. Carter's eyes widened slightly, not from pride, from surprise. Professor Whitmore faced the students again. "Yesterday I failed this classroom, and I failed him." No laughter followed, no whispers. "I made a joke," she said, "and in doing so I reduced a man's entire life to a stereotype. I hid my arrogance behind humor and called it harmless. It wasn't—" Her voice wavered, just a little. "I am sorry," she said, "to Dr. Carter, and to all of you." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't heavy with judgment. It was heavy with truth. Dr. Carter stood still, his hands resting on the handle of his cart. He didn't smile. He didn't nod dramatically. He simply listened. Professor Whitmore stepped aside. "I've invited Dr. Carter to share his story today," she said. "If he chooses to—" Every eye turned to him. He hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded once. He stepped forward, not to the board, but to the center of the room. His voice was calm, his tone gentle. "I didn't plan to speak," he said. "I didn't plan for any of this." He glanced around at the students, at their young faces filled with questions they had never been taught to ask. "I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, learned enough, proved yourself enough, the world would meet you halfway," he said. "Life taught me otherwise." He spoke of lost opportunities, of doors that closed quietly, of illness, of family obligations, of how quickly a respected title can disappear when survival becomes the priority. "I didn't lose my knowledge," he said, "but I lost the room that would listen. No one interrupted. I clean classrooms now," he continued, "not because I failed, but because life demanded something different of me. And work is work. Dignity doesn't disappear because the world stops clapping." He looked at Professor Whitmore. "I don't need apologies," he said. "I need respect, just like everyone else." She nodded, tears burning behind her eyes. The university listened. Word spread again, but this time the story changed. Emails followed. Meetings were scheduled. Administrators asked questions they should have asked long ago. Offers came in slowly at first. Guest lectures, research roles, opportunities that felt both overdue and fragile. Recognition returned, not all at once, not perfectly, but real. Dr. Carter accepted what felt right. He declined what didn't. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand anything. He moved forward with the same quiet dignity he had always carried, even when no one noticed. And Professor Whitmore changed. Not overnight, not magically, but truly. She stopped teaching from above. She stopped using her authority as armor. She started listening more than she spoke. She invited questions she didn't have answers to. She acknowledged the limits of her own experience. She learned that intelligence doesn't always wear the clothes we respect, that brilliance doesn't always announce itself, that greatness doesn't ask permission to exist. The classroom stayed bright, but the light inside it grew stronger. Students leaned in now, not because they were afraid to be wrong, but because they were curious to understand. Discussions deepened. Silence became thoughtful instead of awkward. The room felt alive in a way it never had before. Dr. Carter sometimes stood at the back watching quietly. Sometimes he taught. Sometimes he cleaned. And sometimes he did both. No one laughed anymore. Months later, the equation was gone from the board, but its lesson remained. Professor Whitmore stood at the front of the room one afternoon looking out at her students. She paused, letting the silence settle, then spoke. "Never confuse position with worth," she said, "and never mistake silence for absence." The students listened, because now they knew the most powerful transformations had come from being proven wrong. They come from being willing to see people, not titles, not uniforms, not assumptions, just people. And at lessons stayed with them long after the classroom emptied, long after the chalk dust settled, long after the world moved on. Because dignity doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone who refuses to let the world define their value.